Namaskar, Narada.
So Manorainjanji, tell us about how you got into Anandanagar. What brought you to the path of bliss?
Oh, it's actually a really interesting story. I feel it was started many years before I even heard about Anandanagar. Just certain choices and decisions I was making along the way. But what really catalysed my entry into the Marg was my mother, actually. It was all her fault. She's an art teacher, was an art teacher, teaching in Perth. And she was teaching a really gifted, talented young Margie called Diaprema. Diaprema got some sort of maybe a scholarship. Well, she certainly got an entry into RMIT in Melbourne, where I was at that time. So my mum rang me up and said, "You've got to go and look after this young woman. She's landing in Melbourne. She doesn't know anybody. She's going to RMIT." And my wife of that time, she was just finishing at RMIT. I kind of knew the ropes, knew a lot of the people.
Do you want to say what RMIT is?
Royal Melbourne Institute of Technology. It's a very well-known and respected art school in Australia. It's one of the best. It's now a university, but it wasn't back then in the 1980s. Anyway, Diaprema rocks up, and she's a really inspired Margie. So she and I get on really well, actually, and I was already doing yoga before that, so she invited me to a yoga class, and she was teaching Koshiki, and she introduced me to a group of the young Dudders who are acharyas teaching meditation in Melbourne, and Nabanilananda and others were all there, and we all got on. I played music. They all played music of different kinds, and very quickly, that was 1986, by early 1987 I was ready to be initiated, and it just went from strength to strength, really. It was like a duck to water, really. It was just like everything that I'd been doing leading up to that all sort of came together in this sort of cosmic explosion. Well, it was for me. It really turned my life upside down in some ways, but it made it all make sense for the first time.
And how long after that before you were on your way to India to meet Baba?
So let's say April I got initiated, and I was on the aeroplane in mid-December.
Wow.
To see Baba. I quit my job. I was teaching at a high school in Melbourne at the time, and I thought, no, I've got to go. I just had to throw myself deeply into this experience, and I also felt very strongly that I didn't have much time. I just felt like I'd left it so late. You know, people like you were initiated in the 70s, and here I was coming along at such a late time, also in my late 20s, and I felt like I just almost missed the boat. So I was running the whole time to catch up. It was a wonderful sort of feeling, but it was also feeling slightly exasperated. Why so late?
So what was your meeting with Baba like? Tell me that.
Oh, that was so interesting. Yeah, we land in Calcutta, and we end up on a train going out to the little township on the edge of Anandanagar. What was it called? Starts with a P.
Punjab.
Punjab, thank you. Yeah, out to Punjab, and we couldn't get off at Punjab because they had a bunch of Indian, the Bengali police were there, and they were all Marxists, though, because of the politics of the time was very, very turbulent. So the train actually stopped somewhere in the middle of nowhere at about 5 in the morning, and all of us trooped off the train who were going to see Baba at Anandanagar, and we had to sort of walk up and down hills being led by, it was very clandestine. It was, for me, the first experience of really being in India. It was exciting. It was also quite disorienting. And I can remember coming down into Anandanagar, and it was like going back 3,000 years. It was totally undeveloped at that time. And coming down, the sun was rising. There were these monks off on the horizon line almost doing bath mantras and so on, standing next to ponds and whatever. It was just like going back thousands of years into a sort of yogic past life or something. I just felt so excited. So that was the actual entry into that Anandanagar space. And then it was later on that first day, we were out walking, and Bubba would walk on the rooftop of his building there, and that was my first sighting of Bubba, was just this small figure off in the distance, and I was kind of like, oh, who's this? I mean, what does this man mean to me, or what is he going to mean to me? Will he mean anything, really? I had this kind of sense of disorientation and expectancy, but I didn't know what to expect. So that was the very first sighting of him. He was off in the distance. He was, a very small figure on the top of a roof, being followed by his PA or whatever, someone holding an umbrella, that type of thing, which obviously became classic hallmarks of seeing Bubba when he was on field walks or out and about, was that kind of thing. It was a few days later that the DMC was, reaching its peak, and thousands of people were everywhere. The big pandals were up with the tents, and they'd set up for Bubba on stage, and I think I got roped into acting in some play for that sort of stuff, which everybody seemed to be doing, and then there was this building up of Bubba was coming to give a discourse. His first discourse that I ever heard was on Microvita, and I just was gobsmacked, because I have a kind of analytical brain, and I was really getting into it. I was thinking, this is just amazing, so that sort of intellectual fascination was there, but also the kind of electricity that would spread through the group, that there was this devotional electricity there that was way beyond any intellectual sort of stuff. And the way that wave after wave would build up, there would be kirtan, there was a whole range of singing happening, and the people were coming in, and then at some point Bubba was coming, so it was Parampita Bubba Ki Jai, and they were sort of shouting and yelling. You know the story, you were there many times, and there's kind of intensity, and then Bubba came on stage, and it was sort of like sort of all the air was sucked out of the room or the space. And he sits there, and he kind of nonchalantly looking around, doing he had very distinctive mannerisms, which if you've ever seen a video, you would know the way he used his hands and the way he'd crack jokes, and someone would come up and garland him and that sort of stuff. And I didn't do Koshiki or Tandava the first time, but later on in that week I got to do that for Bubba in one of those situations. It was probably the first, let's say, of January, the first day of January. Of 1988, but the whole atmosphere was electric, and that's what I remember most. I remember being fascinated by his presence and the one-pointedness of that. I guess that's the guru presence, that incredible bang like that. And of course, at the end of the 31st of December. DMC talk that he gave Mudra, and that was my first experience, direct experience of the Varabhaya Mudra, and that was kind of like my whole being was, I would have to say recalibrated. I can't give it a better word. There was stuff going on, and I had no idea what was going on, but it was just wondrous, and that magic stays with me. Whenever if I hear some of the recordings from that period, I don't even have to see the videos. A lot of them are available now on YouTube or whatever. But yeah, that feeling of an expanded world is what I would have to say is what I get out of that. And that's devotionally expanded, personally expanded, culturally expanded, intellectually, the whole lot, and that's the gift of Guru to me personally. And of course, I would have to say you don't have to be necessarily in the presence of someone like Bubba to have that. I think I've seen many young people come to Anandanagar who have, I can see it in their eyes. This, again, the same things that were going on for me in my early stages are going on for them. Yeah, so that was my first experience of Bubba at Anandanagar. Then I went back December of 1988, December of 1989 as well. And each experience was qualitatively different. Each one was me getting to taste Guru in a different way, I'd have to say. So at the end of 1988, I went back, and there was the same sort of theatre going on, but one thing was that I got really quite sick with dysentery while I was there during the peak of this period, actually. And I can remember seeing Baba in, let's say, on top of the roof, like last time, and then seeing Baba also going somewhere in a car with people running behind and the dust rising up because the roads weren't sealed or anything. And that was a special thing, but I could also feel that I was getting sicker and sicker and sicker, and I ended up with really bad dysentery. On the first night, I couldn't actually attend the DMC Pandal. I was just so sick, and I remember hearing, because it was all loudspeakered and everything, hearing the sounds of people cheering for Baba coming on stage, and I was lying in my sleeping bag feeling absolutely miserable. And then there was this kind of other feeling came over me, where Baba was obviously giving a discourse, and then Baba was doing the mudra, and you could hear the people and the shouts and everything, and this wave came over. But then it felt like Baba was standing at the foot of my sleeping bag. And I had this incredible blissful experience while I was sitting there feeling absolutely horrid and wretched. So that was a different way of realizing that when you have this relationship, a spiritual relationship with the Guru, that something else is happening. All sorts of stuff that the rational mind doesn't get. But it was very, very sweet feeling. And then the next day I was back enough on my feet to go to the 1st of January, the Renaissance Universal talk. And that was wonderful again. It was another talk on Microvita from memory. But what was interesting again about that was that I was able to, I was up very close, and I was able to see Baba very much in action, able to see his facial expressions. And again, it's just kind of like you're in a group of, let's say, 20,000, 30,000 people, because there are massive numbers of people there. But what struck me was how I also felt that I was there with Baba on my own, in some sense. And I'm sure this is a common feeling, that this devotional bhav, you would call it, that you're there and suddenly there's something about happening with that Baba person up there, that cosmic entity, you'd have to say, that is, again, you can't put your finger on it, but he's touching me. And later on in that period, that 1988 visit, we were back in Calcutta, and Baba was in the Lake Gardens, and I was there walking along the street heading towards Baba, but he was going off for field walk, and we were actually late, the group of people I was with. But as he went past, he told the car to almost stop, and he did this very slow namaskar to us as he was passing. Little acts of care like that are also things that I remember about Baba. We'd see him lots of times, and there would be these moments when he would notice someone, and you would see him give them this greeting, and it was almost like everything stops, just like that. So that was the sort of things that were happening in 1988. And then at the end of 1989, Baba was very sick, and he was there was no Anandanagar DMC. They did run a DMS at that time, but I chose to stay in Tildula with where Baba was, but he was also in hospital over that period of time. And again, I got really sick. I can remember being horribly sick. And there was just, 5-6 days of ongoing constant kirtan in the big pandal there at Tildula. And there was no Baba physically there, but there was this growing sense of devotion. And when the ambulance came in with Baba in it, bringing him back to Tildula, it was like the parting of the Dead Seas, you know, people just parted like that. And he came out and immediately he was doing Baba thing, namaskar to everybody, and they gave him his cane, and I think he hopped into the wheelchair actually, and he was wheeled off. But it was that waiting for Baba in the most ordinary of senses, if you've ever waited for somebody who's been sick and you love dearly, it's that sort of thing. But there was, of course, that extra special group feeling of this massive amount of humanity packed into Tildula, just waiting for the Guru to return. And he jumps out of or he doesn't jump out of the ambulance, but he comes out and he greets us. I think you might have been there at that time, Nara, from memory. But it was lovely. And it was at the same time, when he was back and he was in recovery mode, he would walk in the gardens and we would wait outside the compound fence type area, and we'd have stacks of bricks and we'd be standing in them peering over. And I worked out, of course, that if you're up on top of the Tildula buildings, you can look straight down into that area, and you can see Baba quite clearly, though from a bit further a distance. So there was a lot of, you know, that kind of game of how can we maintain our connection, our physical connection with Baba when he's kind of withdrawing himself from the world. He was being withdrawn from the world through his own ill health and so on. And yet this strong connection with him was there, and the games that we would all play to see which ways we can get to see Baba and so on. So that was the end of 1989 and into the beginning of 1990. And at that time I went back to Australia, and I was teaching at the little Ananda Pali school at the time. And something just grew in me between, let's say, that return in January and sometime in around Easter. And I thought, I have to go back. It just kept on going in at me. And I can't go back at the end of the year. Something was saying, I've got to go back. So I got tickets and I flew back in October, very early October of 1990. And I rock up, and Baba's running at what you'd have to say, 200, 300% of energy-wise. He's only sleeping 2-3 hours a day, and it was at this period that he started up the Gurukul organisation, which is his university organisation, or education more broadly. He was, giving 3, 4, 5 Prabhat Sangeet in a day. He was initiating into Kapalik many of the workers, and he was giving PC out all over the place. And it was at this time that I was lucky enough to get my PC, that I walked in, and almost there was one dada there who knew me from Australia. He said, "Manorainjan, come here." And I said, "Okay." He said, "Do you want PC?" And I said, "Of course, I want PC. When? Sign me up." So we went through this interesting drama in that lead up to PC, where you had to do some classes, you had to take an exam, and all of that sort of stuff. And it came to the that's right. And then there was Diwali or Deepavali, or Diwali, depending on how you want to pronounce it, Deepavali, which is a wonderful festival of light. It's incredibly crazy in India. It's all noisy and bang, crackers and all sorts of stuff. But Baba, that was on the 17th of October, I remember the date even, and Baba was going to give a talk, which he did that night, and I did Tandava and Koshiki for him. This is before I did my PC. And it was one of the most blissful times, I think I'd have to say, I've had with Baba in any kind of collective setting. It was in the small room in Tildula, so it was much smaller, much more intimate. But it was, I'd confess to an aesthetic kind of feeling, and I really love beauty. And our sister had given Baba a counterpane to go over his bed, his couch that he would sit on. It was blue satin, and he came out wearing a pink salmon-coloured satin top, and sitting there on the blue and the pink, and it was just beautiful, aesthetically beautiful, and he vibrated this kind of subtle energy that was different from the energy that I felt before. And of course, this is totally subjective, but this is what I was feeling. And he gave a talk in Bengali, it wasn't in English. And I've often wondered where it ended up, because I've never seen that date or that talk, but it was recorded like all these talks were. Anyway, and at the end of that, he gave a really slow mudra, and it was just, and it was the first time that something different happened to me. The mudras kind of I could feel them doing something, but this one was like an electric shock. And it was like straight through the heart, and I was kind of vibrating all over. It was Baba for me at his most intimate. And I say that because when I had PC, it was a more formal process, whereas this was more like a large family greeting or hug or whatever. I remember there was a lot of comedy there, because Baba was initiating all these workers into Kapalik, and after being initiated into Kapalik, it was a system where they would all garland Baba, but there were 20 or 30 or 40, I can't remember how many. There was just this massive crowd of, newly full orange workers there who were coming out. And Baba got really annoyed. They were all trying to garland him, and Pratap was there, who was Baba's VSS guard, and Pratap was almost picking these workers up and tossing them across the stage. It was interesting, because you had this kind of comedy going on, this drama, this theatre, at the same time as there was this Baba there, and I was just transfixed. So, but I do remember that very clearly, because it was of the contrast. And then 3-4 days later, on the 20th, I in the morning, I was one of the lucky ones to get one of the last PCs with Baba. There were 2 groups of 4, and I was the first of the first group, and that was, of course, something extra special, not simply because it was one of the last, but because it was my PC with Baba, and of course that personal connection is there. So I went in and feeling totally vulnerable, totally exposed. It was a really interesting feeling, I thought, oh God, here I am standing in front of Baba who can see everything. and Baba was, he's not physically, he wasn't a big man, but he was just like filled the whole room. And I was sitting down there in front of him and on the couch, and he was asking me questions about what did I do, and he would love the fact that I was a historian, so to speak. I'd studied history, and we talked about history and archaeology, and then of course so there's a formula to PC, and it was kind of like Baba said, okay, so essentially he said, you've been a naughty boy, right? And I said, of course, Baba. Hold out your hand. And he picked up his cane and he went like that, and he went down and stopped just above my hand and just tapped my hand like that. And then he said, take an oath. So he told me to cross my hands across my chest, and he put his hand on my head, which just felt like having Mount Everest on your head. It was really like, and I took a series of oaths basically to work for the benefit of humanity. But of course it was much more detailed than that, but I keep those oaths to myself in a sense, so I don't go into them in great detail. As the PC was over and I was feeling totally kind of overwhelmed, and he would say this, I think, to every second person who was going out of PC, and he said, smile more. Because I was probably looking very serious and sort of dumbfounded. But that was, I was the 8th class person to get PC, and I always feel very privileged for that. And it makes me understand how it was, or why it was, that I felt I had to go back. And that calling to go back was so compelling. I couldn't explain it to anybody at all. And people asked me, why are you leaving in the middle of, a school year, in the middle of a school term? And I had to go. But I also feel because the next day was the day that Baba died, and that was also obviously a very intense, special time. But it was kind of like I felt that Baba had kind of done everything they needed to do for every individual that was in that world, in the world of around Baba. And Tildula was very edgy, very distracted across the day. No, I couldn't do proper sadhana. I was finding it really hard. Every time I tried to do dhyan, which is focusing on Baba, my mind would sort of skit and shiver all over the place. And as I started to notice the way other people were, it was very superficial. And it was kind of like we all had to look away from Baba so he could actually leave his body. That's my feeling. That's what it felt like. It didn't make sense at the time, but in hindsight, over the days following, as you know, people came from all over the world, and I remember you coming, Narada. We were all sort of there in whatever role we were playing, you could say, in this drama. That the shock on that evening was immense, because Baba died in the afternoon. We were called into the major pandal. GS got up there, and but essentially he started yelling at us that Baba is dead. Baba's left his body. Baba's left his body. Baba's left his body, and he yelled it, many times. And I remember the Dada who got me in line for the PC. He turned to me with this, and it was good 20 odd years older than me, and he said, "Now all the charm and fascination has left this world." And I remember the absolute emptiness in his eyes, and I was feeling so many things. Because I was thinking, I got PC yesterday, and I was feeling that sort of contradictions of feelings. It was a really tumultuous time. But then it was like that evening, the moon was out. I don't know what phase it was in, but there was moonlight everywhere, and we were lined up outside the compound, and we were standing there in silence, and the sisters went in first to see Baba in state, you could say, lying in state. And we'd all walk through the same room that I'd taken PC in the day before. And, it was really, and everything was in slow motion. And I remember one of the Dadas who'd got Kapalik the week before and he'd been trying to garland Baba. At the time, he was a little fragile sparrow of a man with a big white beard. He would have been in his 60s or 70s, I would think. And he was just crumpled up on the side of a set of stairs somewhere, just weeping and weeping and weeping. It was just like, this feeling of the world forever has changed, you could say. And of course it was because of our physical relationship with Baba. I mean, Baba's gone on to have, I've not lost my relationship with Baba in any way. In fact, it's got deeper over the many years. But certainly you could say it was a tipping point in all our lives, those who were, drawn to Baba, but also a tipping point in terms of the direction that the organisation's taken and all that kind of thing since then.
Watershed.
Yeah, it was a watershed, exactly. And then there was this, they built this incredible platform, a jantra, on which Baba was cremated. And I went in 3 times because anybody was allowed to come and see Baba over that period of time. And I remember I went in that evening to see Baba, and it's kind of like there was a lightness around his body, like the vayus were vibrating. It was very, very interesting, and so there was that. And then as that week went by, I went a number of times, and for me then, my whole life changed pace. No longer was there this drive to go to India in the way that I had been. I remember going the year after, 1991, 92, because we had the first global Gurukul meeting for Neohumanism. And I've been as an educator, I've been very involved with Neohumanism over the years, trying to understand what it means, what its implications are and so on. So I went to that. But Anandanagar, for me personally, felt empty. And and my life since then, it's been a growing internal relationship with Baba and Guru, Guru Dev, as they say. So that's pretty much the story of my physical encounters with Baba.
So you also had some ectoplasmic bliss with Baba?
Yes, I did. Yes, I had a very, very interesting dream where I was with a group of devotees and we were at the crucifixion of Jesus. And I remember there was a ladder, and interestingly enough, some of you will remember a beautiful devotee called Gautami from Anandapali. She was there with me, and she went up and she put the crown of thorns onto Jesus' head, and I was below, and the blood came splattering down, and I looked at the feet of this person being crucified, and they were Baba's feet, as I remember them from when he had rigor mortis, and that the way the toes were curling and so on. They were exactly Baba's feet, and I remember touching the feet, and it was Baba. But for some reason, we're born into a Christian culture. I have a Christian iconography there. I can only imagine that was what it was. But perhaps it's also that the Guru is cosmic. Ultimately, it's not this body or that body, you know, Muhammad, Buddha, Jesus, Krishna, Shiva, whoever. Maybe that's the way to understand it. But certainly that was one dream. And another dream, we have lots of dreams, I guess, along the way. At different times. Sometimes lots, and then a drought, and then some others. But I remember this particular dream was one where I was with Baba, and we were in Tildula, looking out. We came out onto the veranda there. There was a veranda area, and looked out. And there below us was a river running, and in the river was a man standing waist deep in the water, chanting, and he was chanting in Sanskrit. Baba said, "Look at this man over here." I said, "Yes, Baba." And he said, "Do you know who he is?" And I said, "I don't know, Baba." He says, "That's Valmiki singing the Ramayana." But I remember it very clearly, because I remember how clear the body of that this man was there. It was kind of like we were looking through time. I don't know what the date for the Ramayana is. It's probably 3,000 or 4,000 years ago or something, I'm guessing. But, you know, and there was this man who had this golden kind of light. He was incredibly vigorous, powerful man in the river, in total sadhu, just in this kind of bliss, chanting this magnificent poem in Sanskrit. And Baba was showing me it. I have no idea why. Can we ever explain these things?
So just finish off. So Manorainjanji, what are you doing now? What have you been doing?
Well, I'm just back from a wonderful festival at an Anandanagar master unit in Portugal called Ananda Kalyani. And I was there to enjoy the spiritual flow, but I was also there to give a few classes. So I'm working at a university on the Sunshine Coast here in Australia. My key interests are in opening up the field of neo-humanism as a cultural, social, creative, aesthetic project. So all those things that were triggered and stimulated years ago by Baba, and obviously were preceded by my studies and whatever, are still flowing strongly, and I just get so much bliss out of. I'm constantly reading and sitting with Baba's words and finding ways that they actually work with the words of others, that our society, our civilization is in a crisis point, but we're in a crisis point where so many souls are rising up to offer a new vision of the world, and it's percolating all around us. It's not something that we have a monopoly of in Anandanagar or anything like that. It's just this amazing groundswell, and I find that neo-humanism fits really nicely with that. And it, you know, for me, that's my core work, is bridge building, I guess it would be, between the world that we inhabit. We're in Australia, for instance, so there's an Australian way of expressing it. But when I work a lot in India still, and I work a lot in Europe, and also some in North America, and I've also went to Brazil, and I'm sure that will keep on opening up. So for me now, it's kind of like spreading the good news. There's this whole amazing cache of wisdom out there that is kind of like a reinvigorated Tantra, which is a reinvigorated indigenous wisdom, the indigenous wisdom of India. Baba he breathed new life into it and gave it a much stronger social focus, a much stronger ecological focus. His love of plants and so on, as people who listen to this probably know, all of that comes through. And his love of humanity and the cosmos. So that for me, I just get drunk on it. So thank you.
Wow, that's a good way to end. Thank you. Namaskar, Manorainjan.
Namaskar. Thank you for interviewing me. It's been a pleasure.